The year is 885. Paris, one of the last great cities of the West, stands on the brink of annihilation. A sea of Viking ships stretches across the Seine, carrying a ruthless army bent on destruction. Inside the city walls, a few hundred defenders face an impossible choice: surrender and face slaughter, or fight against overwhelming odds. As the siege tightens, a king's cowardice, a count's bravery, and a warrior bishop's defiance will decide the fate of Paris and the future of France. This isn't just a battle for survival, it's a battle for the soul of an empire. You won't believe how this story ends. The Siege of Paris stands out as one of the most dramatic Viking incursions along the Seine River in the kingdom of the West Franks. This pivotal event not only represented a major Viking offensive, but also became a turning point in the fate of both the Carolingian dynasty and the emerging nation of France. It tested the resolve of Paris's defenders and highlighted the city's importance as a strategic stronghold, an importance that would only grow in the centuries to come. For the Franks, this siege underscored Paris's central role in their defensive strategy and its rising political influence, as the city was one of the largest and most fortified settlements in West Francia at the time. The siege is vividly chronicled in the eyewitness account by the monk Abbo Cernuus, who immortalized the events in his Latin poem Bella Parisiacae Urbis. The Viking fleet, composed of hundreds of ships and carrying thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of fierce Norse warriors, arrived on the outskirts of Paris in late November 885. Their appearance was no ordinary raid, it was a formidable show of strength, aimed at extracting tribute from the city. As they had done so many times before, the Vikings demanded gold, silver, or other wealth in exchange for sparing the city from destruction. Odo, the stalwart Count of Paris, refused this demand, despite having only a small force of a few hundred men at his disposal. This refusal was a gamble that could have led to catastrophe. Odo knew that if he paid the tribute, the Vikings would likely return later, demanding even more. His decision to resist was an act of defiance that demonstrated his understanding of the broader stakes. Paris could not afford to appear weak. Even though the odds were not in their favor, the city's defenders prepared for what was to come. The Vikings, skilled in siege warfare, unleashed a series of ferocious attacks using advanced siege engines. They brought battering rams, ballistae, and catapults to bear against the city's stout defenses. However, despite their technological advantage and the ferocity of their attacks, the Viking warriors failed to breach Paris's walls. The Franks had prepared for this eventuality. The city was well fortified, with stone walls and robust towers guarding the bridges that spanned the Seine. After several days of intense fighting, the Viking forces, frustrated by their lack of success, withdrew, though they did not abandon the siege entirely. Instead of launching further full-scale assaults, the Vikings maintained a blockade, hoping to starve the defenders into submission. For months, Paris stood firm under siege, enduring hunger, disease, and the constant threat of attack. Many of the Viking warriors eventually left the city to raid further upriver, seeking easier plunder elsewhere. Despite their relative withdrawal, a core group of Vikings remained to keep pressure on Paris, and they launched another attack during the summer of 886, though this too ended in failure. In October 886, Charles the Fat, ruler of West Francia, finally arrived with his army, ostensibly to relieve Paris and drive the Viking invaders away once and for all. Charles had come to power as a direct descendant of Charlemagne, inheriting a legacy of military might and empire building, yet his actions during the siege of Paris would tarnish his reputation and forever mark him as a leader unwilling or unable to decisively confront the Viking threat. Much to the shock and dismay of the Parisians, Charles did not engage the Vikings in battle. He chose not to fight, despite the valiant efforts of Paris's defenders, who had risked their lives for months to hold off the invaders. Instead, Charles negotiated with the Vikings, allowing them to sail further up the Seine to raid Burgundy, which at the time was in revolt against him. Even more damaging to his reputation was his decision to pay the Vikings 700 livres, equivalent to 257 kilograms of silver, as a bribe to encourage them to leave. For Odo, who had personally overseen the defense of the city, this was an insult. Odo had demonstrated extraordinary leadership during the siege, rallying his troops, coordinating the defense of the bridges, and ensuring that morale remained high even in the face of overwhelming odds. To see Charles capitulate to the Vikings without a fight was a betrayal. Odo's criticisms of Charles' strategy became well known, and his defiance would play a key role in the political changes that followed. When Charles died in 888, Odo was elected as the first first non-Carolingian king of the Franks, marking the end of Carolingian dominance and the beginning of a new era in French history. The siege of Paris in 885 was not the first time that Vikings had attacked Francia, nor would it be the last. The first major Viking assault on Paris occurred in 845 when the legendary Norse chieftain Ragnar Lodbrok led a fleet of 120 ships up the Seine. The Vikings, numbering around 5,000 men, sacked the city, and King Charles the Bald, who ruled West Francia at the time, was forced to pay them a hefty ransom to leave. The Vikings returned to Paris multiple times during the following decades. By the 860s, they had perfected the art of exploiting the Frankish kingdom's internal divisions and weak leadership. These raids were often devastating, but the Franks began to adapt. In 864, Charles the Bald issued the Edict of Pistre, which mandated the construction of bridges across the Seine, including 2 in Paris. These bridges played a crucial role in the defense of the city during the siege of 885, as they prevented Viking ships from sailing further upriver. At the same time, the political landscape of West Francia was in turmoil. Following the death of Charles the Bald in 877, the kingdom was ruled by a succession of short-reigning kings, none of whom could establish a stable, unified government. This period of instability created a power vacuum that allowed local lords, such as Odo, the Count of Paris, to increase their influence. One of the most important figures in the defense of Paris was Odo's father, Robert the Strong. Robert had been a key military leader in the struggle against the Vikings, particularly in the Loire Valley, where he fought them continuously until his death in battle in 866. His death left a leadership void that Odo eventually filled, continuing his father's legacy by defending Paris from the Viking onslaught. However, unlike his father, Odo's efforts were more closely tied to the survival of the Frankish state itself. By the time of the siege of 885, the Carolingian monarchy was so weakened that Odo's leadership became critical, not just for Paris, but for the future of the entire kingdom. As the Viking leaders Sigfrid and Sinric sailed up the Seine in 885, their sights were set on Paris, a city that had already proven vulnerable to their attacks. Sigfrid, representing the Viking forces, demanded a bribe from King Charles, but when Charles refused, the Viking chieftains decided to take matters into their own hands. With a fleet of 700 ships carrying as many as 30,000 or 40,000 men, the Vikings advanced on Paris. Paris at that time was a relatively small city built on a natural island in the Seine. This location gave Paris its strategic importance, as its bridges could block ships from passing further up the river. These bridges, one made of stone and one of wood, were crucial to the city's defense. The shallow Viking longships could not navigate past them, forcing the invaders to engage the city directly. Odo, the Count of Paris, fortified the bridgeheads by constructing towers to defend against Viking incursions. He was joined by his brother Robert and Bishop Goslin, the city's ecclesiastical leader, who took up arms to defend his people. Goslin's role in the siege is legendary. He is remembered as one of the first fighting bishops in medieval literature, leading his flock in both prayer and battle. The Viking assault began on 24 or the 25th of November 885, when their ships arrived at Paris. The first demand for tribute was met with defiance, and on the 26th of November the Vikings launched their initial attack. Using their siege engines, ballistae, mangonels, and catapults, the Vikings attempted to breach the city's defenses. However, they were repulsed by the defenders, who used boiling wax and pitch to thwart their advances. Despite their best efforts, the Vikings could not penetrate the walls, and the Parisians used the night to reinforce their defenses further. The next day, the Vikings renewed their assault. They brought battering rams to the city gates, attempted to set fire to the walls, and even tried to mine under the fortifications. Once again, the Parisians held firm. Bishop Goslin personally led the defense, armed with a bow and an axe, exhorting his fellow citizens to stand their ground. At one point, he placed a cross on the outer defenses to inspire the defenders. Realizing that they could not take Paris by force in a single strike, the Vikings settled in for a long siege. They established a camp on the right bank of the river and began constructing additional siege engines. For 2 months, the Vikings maintained their blockade, making trenches, gathering supplies, and launching occasional raids on the surrounding countryside. In January 886, the Vikings attempted to bypass the city's defenses by filling the river shallows with debris and dead bodies, hoping to create a path around the bridgehead. After days of effort, they tried to send burning ships downstream to destroy the wooden bridge. Though the bridge held, its foundations were weakened by flooding in early February, and on the 6th of February, the bridge finally collapsed. This left the northeast tower, which had been defending the bridge, isolated with only 12 defenders inside. The Vikings demanded their surrender, but the defenders refused and were killed to the last man. Despite this minor victory, the Vikings were still unable to breach the city. Frustrated by their lack of progress, many of them left to raid other cities, including Le Mans, Chartres, and Évreux, while the remaining Viking forces continued the siege. Odo, sensing that time was running out, sent messengers to Charles the Fat, pleading for reinforcements. In the meantime, Odo managed to slip some men through the Viking lines to gather supplies, while morale among the Vikings continued to falter. Siegfried, desperate to end the siege, accepted 60 pounds of silver and departed in April. However, another Viking leader, Rollo, remained with his men, hoping to continue the assault. In May, disease began to spread through the city, claiming the life of Bishop Goslin. Odo once again risked everything, slipping through enemy lines to petition Charles for aid. Charles finally agreed to intervene, and Odo fought his way back into Paris. According to historian Joshua J. Mark, Odo returned with Charles' forces, driving back the Vikings. However, Henry, Count of Saxony, who had accompanied the king, died after falling into a Viking trench and being captured. The Vikings made one final unsuccessful attempt to take Paris during the summer of 886. When Charles and his imperial army arrived in October, they dispersed the Viking forces without direct combat. Rather than driving the Vikings out of Francia altogether, Charles allowed Rollo and his men to sail up the Seine to Burgundy, which was in revolt, and paid them the promised 700 livres of silver in the spring of 887. The aftermath of the siege was both a military and political turning point for West Francia. The Parisians, led by Odo, refused to let the Vikings sail down the Seine, forcing them to drag their ships overland to the Marne to escape. Charles' inability to decisively end the Viking threat and his willingness to pay tribute weakened his standing among the Frankish nobility. When he died in 888, Odo was elected king, the first ruler of West Francia not descended from Charlemagne. The Rebertian family, to which Odo belonged, would continue to play a central role in the politics of West Francia. Odo's brother, Robert I, would later be crowned king, and his descendants, including Hugh Capet, would eventually establish the Capetian dynasty, which ruled France for centuries. Paris, though battered by the siege, emerged stronger than ever. The right bank, which had been spared the worst of the destruction, continued to develop, while the left bank, heavily damaged by the Viking attacks, reverted to agricultural use. Over time, Paris would grow into the political and cultural heart of France, its significance cemented by its role in repelling one of the largest Viking invasions in history. Thank you for watching the epic tale of the Siege of Paris. If you enjoyed this journey through history and want to see more stories of battles, heroes, and the events that shaped our world, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss an upload. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this incredible battle, so drop a comment below. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring history.